Chair recognizes myself for the purpose of asking questions. Mr. Sopko, the White House press secretary was just asked about an hour ago whether the Biden administration has stonewalled you and your office. She responded that and I quote, "The Biden administration has consistently provided updates and information." My question, sir, has the Biden administration cooperated with your investigation?
I can't talk about the whole administration, but I can talk about state and aid and DOD, and no, they haven't. And I'm happy to give you chapter and verse on that.
Have they consistently provided updates and information?
No.
Do you have all the information you need to complete your work?
No.
Is it even the administration's decision to determine what information and documents your office is entitled to?
No. That flies in the face of what an independent IG should do. We determine what we need, who we need to talk to, and what reports we write. Otherwise, we're not independent inspectors general.
Well, I'm sure the Washington Post fact checker will correct her. Mr. Sopko, in President Biden's memo released earlier this month, he indicated he was bound by the Trump administration's DOER agreement when it came to planning for the withdrawal. The President Trump's agreement outlined several conditions the Taliban had to meet for the U.S. forces to leave. After the agreement negotiated by President Trump and President Biden's inauguration, how many U.S. service members were killed in action in Afghanistan? After President Trump's and President Biden's inauguration?
The only ones were the unfortunate individuals killed.
There were zero at that time. For over a year, the agreement negotiated by President Trump kept our military men and women serving in Afghanistan safe while we were still at war. The agreement negotiated by President Trump ensured not one life was lost at the hands of the Taliban, ISIS, or al-Qaeda. Now, is it your understanding that the Biden administration was bound to enforce an agreement negotiated by the Trump administration?
That's really beyond my pay grade.
Because they've undone a lot of other executive orders and resolutions and agreements, but were they bound to this particular agreement?
We didn't look at that, so I couldn't tell you, sir. I'm sorry.
In your testimony, you mentioned the withdrawal of contractors from Afghanistan and how it contributed to the collapse of the Afghan government. Did SIGAR ever provide any kind of report before the withdrawal on what the removal of contractors may do? And what was the significance of contractors' work in Afghanistan?
We alerted numerous administrations on that going back to 2013. We kept talking about the inability of the Afghan military to fight on their own. And I think as late as January of that year, we highlighted in particular the problem of the support for the Air Force, that it would cause the collapse of the Air Force within a matter of months.
You referred several times to the Afghan fund being in Switzerland.
Yes.
In a Swiss account. That
Yes.
sounds peculiar to me. Why a Swiss account? Wouldn't that be the hardest country on the planet to get any information about an account and where the funds were being spent?
Well, Mr. Chairman, when you think of openness and transparency in financial institutions, you usually don't think of Switzerland.
Yeah.
They don't go together.
The president's family will wish they had thought of Switzerland here before long.
I'm not going to go there, sir. All I'm saying is that one of the questions we have is what rules of law cover the access to that material? Is it Swiss law or is it U.S. law? And so that was one of the questions we asked Treasury, and we still haven't heard back.
Right. Mr. Storch, it's my understanding the Department of State believed it was going to maintain a diplomatic presence with the U.S. Embassy in Kabul, while the intelligence community and Department of Defense were clear about the threat from the Taliban. As the lead IG who works with many different IGs to examine Afghanistan, how can departments streamline their efforts to create more coherent evacuation strategies? Microphone. Hit the microphone. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm sorry. It's a great question. I know that my colleague from the Department of State has indicated their office is doing work on that, so maybe it's better for her.
Good. Please, Ms. Shaw.
That's exactly right. Thank you so much. Our work is looking at the issues with the evacuation and in particular the planning and execution, and we will have recommendations to help in the future.
Okay. Let me ask one last question before my time expires. What was the number the State Department estimated about how many evacuees there would be prior to the evacuation? Because the estimates that I was hearing prior to the evacuation and the total number of evacuees far exceeded the numbers that I was hearing. Can you answer that question?
Sure. So I don't have the precise number that they were anticipating, but our work did find that they were not prepared to evacuate as many people as they did. And in part, it has to do with the way the rules are set up. So in an evacuation, typically planning would include U.S. Citizens and permanent residents and U.S. staff. But of course, there were many more at-risk Afghan partners and allies that ultimately were considered for evacuation.
Should we be concerned that there were significantly more people who were evacuated than what we had planned on evacuating? In other words, could there be Taliban people that we evacuated to the United States from Afghanistan?
Certainly, it's a risk that I think is baked into the process. So the screening and vetting is incredibly important, and we're actually partnering with the Department of Homeland Security, OIG, to look specifically at those processes to assess that risk.